Welcome to Between Shelves.
where we make connections between literature, theology, philosophy, psychology, and culture.
Join us as we explore the interconnectedness of race, spirituality, psychology, and metamodernism.
Each episode invites you into a thought-provoking journey, unpacking how these elements shape our understanding of the world and ourselves.
My name is Aaron Waldron. We're a religiously traumatized theopoet and a shaman in journey. Our work focuses on creating community and between spaces for religiously traumatized millennials, navigating life beyond colonized religion.
And my name is Rafael Reyes. My work is on the importance of imagination and theopoetics in philosophy and religious pluralism.
We invite you to Between Shelves
To learn,
listen,
and become.
All right, welcome back to the next part of the dialogue. It's good to be back. We're back here with Raphael and myself, episode 12. Today we are talking about metamodernism and truth. And this is an interesting topic because where does one begin to even imagine what is truth? Can anyone really stake a claim of what is truth? Is it something that can be measured and is binary? These are things that we kind of want to flush out today and maybe pull in some authors, invite some cool authors to help us talk about this topic of truth and help us understand how in a metamodern framework of thinking, what does truth look like, or what can it look like? So you have any initial thoughts, Raphael?
Truth in terms of tradition is multi-layered. And there have been these sort of different ways of seeing truth or what is true. And, I'm not considering myself an expert in that. There have been authors that have been writing prolifically on this subject. But when you do the study of philosophy, they always bring in specific understandings of truth. Like, so initially, there's the one called the correspondence theory of truth, right? If you have a belief and it is something that can be verified, like this corresponds to this, and when another person sees it, they can deem that as a truth, right? Or it turns into a fact. And so we see correspondence relating very much to the sciences, right? This correspondence theory of truth that the study of physics deals with the correspondence theory of truth. So that's one piece. And the most simplistic example is the sky is blue. Well, when I look with my eyes, sky is blue, right? As I know it. And that's what they call a correspondence theory of truth. Then they have something called coherence theory of truth. And I'll read this part. A statement or a belief is true if it fits logically and consistently within a larger system of accepted beliefs. So if you have these accepted beliefs and you says, well, therefore it means this. Does it cohere? Does it hang well? If you were to put a hanger, if I put this on, will it work? Will it stick? And so that's what, when we talk about a coherence theory of truth, this truth that we talk about, when we use these systems of thinking and these other truths, then it works well. Does it work well or was it not? And then, you have a constructivist or social constructivist view, which is truth is based on that sort of language and context and the cultures that we exist in. They have their own set of truths, right? If, for example, I myself as a Puerto Rican coming from my community have a certain way of understanding what family structure looks like, how we handle, situations, or what are our values and goals when we're looking at careers or statements of faith or belief. In that space are these constructed or socially constructed understandings of truth that could be more stronger, more deeper for us in that sense. So, and then you have like the pragmatic theory of truth, right? Which is if it works, then it's true. Right? That's the most simplest thing, right? And we see this a lot maybe when we're actually working out in the real world, right? We have these hundreds of theories, but I'm going to do the thing that works. So this pragmatic theory of truth, that's just an example. This pragmatic theory of truth is what is the most functional, the most utilitarian at the time? Because then that leads to a truth, because we can build from that. And so these are some theories of truth that have that surround the world that we live in. That's part of the world that we live and exist in today. And I think the truth that we're kind of engaging in our discussion is really just talking about truth and like, is there one truth? Right? And that affects our understanding of a coherence theory of truth or a corresponding theory of truth, and all of them. It affects all of that. Is there one ultimate truth? Are there many truths? How are we meant to engage? Should we be focusing only on one and then we kind of poo-poo the rest? What's that? And I think that has been part of our discussion, especially when we talk about this idea of metamodernism and its engagement in various aspects on race, on theology, for that matter. So that's kind of the stuff. Please continue, add your thoughts.
Yeah, as you were talking, you made me think of how you're right. We've been on this journey in dialogue over the past 11 so episodes of this season thus far, exploring different truths, and truths can also be seen as narratives, stories, people's truths, individuals' truths, nations' truths, so there's so many layers, like you're saying, to these truths. And then there's also truths that some people can relate to, which I guess we would suggest is more meta-spiritual, spiritual across the front, but even so spiritual in the sense that we maybe don't even know yet. And that's like this intuitive truth. I think that's the best way to kind of describe it. When people have like a gut feeling and intuition, it's a form of truth, right? It shed light on something that now you can use and it's helpful and you can grow from it or develop from it. It's very fruitful as in religious context. And so that's interesting too. And then you also made me think of, there's no one truth, but in monotheism, especially Christianity, they say things like, Yeshua or Jesus is the way, the truth, the light, and this is also corresponds or is alluding to God is the ultimate truth. Now, we're not a firm believer in literal interpretation, but we thought maybe it would be fruitful to just talk about this for a little bit on what do we mean in a metamodern framework when we're talking maybe spiritual or religious and we're referring to the divine, but also trying to associate the divine with truth. What are your thoughts on that?
You're throwing that at me? Man, that just threw me on the bus.
This is right up your alley. It's an alley-oop.
Oh my gosh. So what's the question? Just say the question one more time.
Got you. So the way we were thinking, right? Because your background is in process theology as well, process thinking. And so if in monotheism, for example, they believe that, God is the truth, the light, the way, this ultimate truth, right? Which comes off very absolute. So we were wondering, from, your process background of thinking that also contributes to metamodernism thinking, what are your thoughts on that? And how would you explain that to, let's say like a religious demographic or seekers of God that maybe have been transitioning from religion and they just are confused. Like, what would you say to that?
So just as for clarity, what I'm hearing in the question is when we're understanding monotheistic understandings of God within a religious system and we tie it in with a metamodern framework, which has a very different understanding of it. What happens? How do we navigate that? I think that's been a problem or an issue or a reality for most of the existence of human beings. Can I say that? Just because we see it biblically, if you look at the formation of biblical scripture, and you see within the Old Testament writings or First Testament writings, depending on what you do, you see engagement between gods. You see engagement between people, but they are really engagements between gods and understanding of God. So when you have, Persian Empire coming in or Babylonian Empire coming in, they have always been conflicts with whose God is more powerful. The Exodus out of Egypt was a direct confrontation of whose God is more powerful. Our God protects us. What does your God do? So in that writing, in the way that the writers had taken it and how they understood their understanding of God and how God works, it's very personal. It's very much directed towards a culture and a people and a group. And I think that's successful and important. I think that's a very powerful time because it's taking what we felt and what we've experienced and it sort of solidifies it into a series of beliefs or dogmas. Right. And that's valuable. I think, when we're talking about what fascinates us, what moves us, that takes time. That takes an important amount of reflection, of looking back at our experience and saying, well, where did I find the most enjoyment or the most passion? Right. And so I think in this same pattern, reflection and thinking, we see these religious formations go into play. And you remind me of when I look at a philosophy of religion from Alfred Whitehead in his Religion in the Making. He says that's an important component of religion, of its formation, is we take this experience and from these, he goes, we go through an event, right? We go through this piece and we have an emotional component, right? And that emotional component is now why we do this ritual, which then forms beliefs. And so when they're writing, they're actually writing their beliefs. They're this formed belief that was orally given, now written. And so and it's powerful. And Whitehead would say, afterwards, we have to now then find coherence for our life. Well, how does it apply to my life? How does it make sense? But there's another part that, we have writers like Catherine Keller and Roland Farber, who I highlight, that start talking about, and Whitehead does the same thing in the same text. What happens after that? How long can that remain intensified, informing novelty and progress? A progress that doesn't let go of tradition. It doesn't let go of tradition. It actually holds on to it, but is looking for this type of coherence, saying, well, how do I honor my tradition but still progress? And that's a fascinating question that Whitehead gives and that both and Farber do. It's sort of this having to come to almost another salvific moment where there's a death and rebirth and saying, okay, now that there's other religious traditions and we're no longer fighting against each other. This is not a fight between my God and your God, but it's an understanding of God. That's a different statement. It's not my God against your God. Now it's, how do I understand God? And I always understood, it's funny. I always understood Roland Farber. He would say, when you become a theologian, your task is no longer to be a Christian or a Muslim or a Hindu. You are seeking God. Now, you might be seeking God through Christian scripture. You might be seeking God through Hindu Vedantic text or Advedantic text. Well, they're not following, but you know what I mean. Or you're seeking Allah through the Quran, or you're trying to find that absoluteness, nothingness through the Bodhisattvic texts, or you're trying to find Allah through the Baha'i text. But you're seeking God. And what that does is it opens up a world that not many people understand. It opens a world that's not easy, and it challenges truth. It forces you to have to think differently about truth. Truth cannot be static. Truth is not absolute in the way we think about absoluteness. And truth is not something that we fully grasp, and so on and so forth. So it's really, I'm sort of talking about it in an apophatic way. That negative theology, God is not, or truth is not this, truth is not that, then what is it? But we get that flow there. And I'm expressing parts of my journey as I struggle through. You're working for a Christian seminary or you work in a Christian school, but I follow God. I don't confine myself to a particular tradition because I'm kind of looking for something that points beyond it. But that's that. But I think to answer that, it lends itself to an interesting understanding of truth that I think metamodernism is alluding to. What we see also in a theopoetic understanding of truth as well, and what I see in a process understanding of truth. I see those three. I think I'm on the way in your response, in your thought proposition there.
Spot on, sir. Spot on. Yeah, you made us think of, thank you for bringing up Theopoetics. That made me think of also, and you brought up Catherine Keller, another great piece. Truthiness, right? Comes up out of what you're talking about as well. This way or some, like you feel true, like truth, you feel truth more than you are, you know it. You know what I mean? If that makes sense. There's like this groundedness in sort of, I think she refers to like objective fact or something like that. But it's interesting because in metamodernism, in this framework, this space of thinking, right? And or you have truth and then you invite truth into that space and then no longer is there like really a battle over right and wrong or which truth is invalid, but somehow in this space, wisdom transforms, right? And truth then becomes something like a Rubik's Cube. Excuse me. And that Rubik's Cube, the way you engage with it can unlock certain, and I find that so interesting, like to play with this analogy in my head, because when people say, what do you think is truth? And it's so hard for me to explain it, but this analogy seems to encapsulate it, like a child playing with a Rubik's Cube, whatever patterns the child recognizes from the movements on the Rubik's Cube, out of that comes truth, and that truth can be critiqued based on life experiences, but then that truth also is coming from somewhere we feel unknown, and sometimes we get a feeling of, wow, this feels so divine. Like God is so intimate with me in this moment right now, that God is sharing this moment with me. God is alive. God is with me. And so, when you have these kind of experiences, especially in a theopoetic space, we did a theo poem way back, and it was on Mi Pastelón. Yeah. And it was about this amazing food dish, right? And some people will look at it and say, but it was just food, but for me, it was just like, we were reflecting on all these different things, such as the ingredients to make this amazing dish and the thought pattern behind why putting together these particular ingredients to make this dish, and a lot of times, those of us that have connections to the Caribbean, a lot of these amazing dishes that we love so much come from trauma, come from not having, come from slavery, come from lack of resources. So the ingenuity, the creativity, and even through a theopoetic lens, the divinity, like to create such a thing that offers fruitfulness, offers sustenance, is just, for me, is just so divine on so many different levels. And that's an example of, when we had that experience eating it, the food, it was kind of like this intuitive feeling of, wow, this is deep, like to be part of this, to remember this, to understand this, it brings a certain level of reverence, like it made me humble and it made me emotional, honestly. And that's what moved me to even consider putting together the Theo poem. But yeah, what are your thoughts on truthiness? Because I know you got a lot of ideas and gems for that one.
I think when a couple of things brought up, I think, but just to go back to truthiness as Catherine defined it, and love to hear her thoughts on that, is that truthiness is just dealing with the fact that there's no single way of understanding truth, but that is ultimately complex. And so there's that part, right? But I think there's a second part to it. It can't only be dealt with logically, right? It can't only be dealt with statistically, which looks at hard sciences and Not that they're wrong, but there's also a feeling component to it, to truth, that you can't deny. So why does someone navigate to one tradition over another? It begins with a feeling that what they're saying, like, man, that's true. Now, let's not be naive. And we could say a lot of people manipulate that. A lot of people manipulate that. So I would want to say, if we truly believe, or when we truly believe in a divine calling, that a person has an honest call to speak the message, right, of the good news, that people can resonate with that because they're resonating with, here's my situation in the world that I'm in. And there's these words that are just resonating. And so they accept this message as true or as truthy. There's a feeling to it. So it's not only a hard science statistics based, but it's a feeling which becomes more concrete and more real as time progresses. I really want to say that because if we look at, let's say, for a really good concrete example, administration made a claim, but as they progress, people are seeing it's not true. So what they felt is not real. What they felt was a falsification. And then another set of thoughts and ideas come into play. We were fooled. We were bamboozled. Someone gave us a false narrative because ultimately they really didn't care. They just wanted their goals. They were, in other words, bullshitting because they didn't really care. They just wanted to make themselves look good and feel good. So I have to make that claim because I have to nuance truthiness, right? I have to sort of abstract it a little bit to get to what I'm getting at. So I think this truthiness that Keller talks about is saying truth is ultimately complex. We can't rely on just one way of looking at things because then we're being naive, we're being foolish. And so we have to trust, and you've mentioned this before, we trust in some of this intuitiveness that we have to get at a decision point of truth. And I think I believe that, there's a feeling component. And feeling, once again, is not just the emotional part. I don't think that at all. I think feeling means experience, how we felt about that experience, how we navigated through that experience and now know more. So feeling has a wisdom to it. That feeling has a wisdom to it that allows us to make some intuitive decisions, if I can say that.
Yeah.
And I think for me, as I'm reading Catherine or Dr. Keller, is probably the more appropriate term, as the more, as I've tried to understand her work, I see that, right? So, fuzziness, when she talks about fuzzy logic, the blurring of the lines, because you really don't know if it's this or that, but it could be both ends. Fuzzy logic, truthiness. Yeah, this is true, but it's always within a certain context. It's never really that. It's never really that. And that's her challenge in her writing, is to say, it will never be just that. So, and I think that kind of allows us to say that process thinking, process theology, process thought exhibits metamodern inklings, right? Metamodern understandings of thought, and they could be kin, for a better term, with that. So yeah, I'll pause there for a bit.
Yeah, you brought up sort of a dark memory in me that I thought we should share, because when you talk about truthiness, the way you were talking about it, it really hit something for me that I think a lot of our listeners could relate to. When I was a child, my mom, she would trick me into believing she wasn't mad so that we would run to her or go to her, or at least get within arm's reach of her, right? And when the first few times as a child, we saw this kind of pattern or this kind of action behavior, we fell for it. It seemed true.
Mm-hmm.
Come here, baby. I'm not mad. I won't hurt you. Come here, And it's like, this is my mom. She's saying these words. It must be true. Get close. Got you. I thought I told you, blah, 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 And then It happened a few other times. And after like maybe the third time, it was like, I don't know. I've seen this pattern before. And based on my feeling, like you're saying, it didn't end well.
Mm-hmm.
It ended with me being hurt because I came to you because you told me it was safe and it was all right, but it wasn't. So then we fast forward, we're a young adult and we experience our first narcissist, right? The narcissist says, I love you. I need you. So I feel special. I feel needed. That's a sense of truth. They make me feel a certain kind of way. I then think this is really truth. Like you said, time passes, time reveals all, right? Then months turns into years, and then years finally see that, I have a collection of patterns that don't add up. What you've been telling me is not truth. What you've been telling me is a distorted truth that you distorted for your agenda and for only your gains and profit, whatever that may be, emotionally, financially. You know what I mean? You get it.
Yeah, I
but
get it.
The point here is like, we see this in life, in everyday mundane life, like this idea that truth is not 100% one thing. It's not so easy to spot too. Your age does not qualify you to be able to spot truth. We learned that one. There's some children that can spot more truth than adults, and there's adults that can spot truth better than children. And so, like, going back to what you're saying, it seems like it's really based on relationships, right? Our experiences of relationships with things and people. Does this lie to me? Does it feed me? Does it, and it's all based, it seems, on patterns,
In this episode of Between Shelves, we delve into the elusive and multifaceted nature of truth and trust through the lens of metamodernism. Join us as we navigate the space between certainty and ambiguity, exploring how this philosophical framework challenges conventional ideas and embraces the complexity of our contemporary world. From art to philosophy, culture, and spirituality, we're unpacking how truth and trust in a metamodern framework of thinking and being disrupts outdated frameworks around race, belonging, and self-expression, opening up new pathways for reimagining what is truth or what can be trusted. Whether you're a seeker, a scholar, or just curious about the evolution of identity in our ever-changing world, this dialogue has something for you. Catch the latest dialogue Between Shelves, streaming now on all your favorite podcast platforms. Don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. Let's explore the in-between together. And now, let's return to our dialogue with Raphael and Aaron as we continue exploring how the nature of truth and trust through the lens of metamodernism reshapes our understanding of knowing and the ever-evolving journey of becoming in the 21st century.
Yes, I think in Whitehead, Alfred North Whitehead, Adventure of Ideas, he talks about truth as recognition of patterns. I don't know what chapter. I'm trying to remember the chapter because it's at the. But he talks about truth as pattern making. I think his understanding is we make truth, discover truth, or make truth. So it is pattern making. We find these patterns, we reveal it. And in part, that's a lot of what he does in his last book, Modern Thought. The last piece he says, part of the role of philosophy is to turn the mystical, that which is hidden, and reveal it. But that will always be an ongoing process, right? We reveal these patterns, and then we make propositions of it. And it's never a deductive tool, even though that's part of it. It's an inductive tool. This. We build it. I wanted to go back to what you were talking about, which is, I'm grateful you're looking at the psychological effects of trust, right? Of what we think to be truthful. I think my mother will keep me safe. Or father, doesn't matter, either one. Or our parental guardian will keep us safe. And that doesn't seem to be the case. So then we develop, and that's trauma. And then we say, okay, it was only for their gain or their means for their moment. And that's real. That's real. I think the discussions on truth as we're understanding here is in terms of thought and in terms of maybe religion and understandings of God. And we are putting it within a box, whether it's old and smelly, I don't know. But we are what Whitehead would say, we do abstract. This is an abstraction. This is an abstraction because we need to think about it a little bit. And then we're supposed to do, like his example, the flight of the airplane. The airplane allows us to imagine. It goes and think, does it work? Does it not work? Where does it need to be fixed or repaired? We go back down, do the work, and then test it again, where he talks about his imaginative generalization. But in the context of that psychological piece and trauma, that adds to our feelings. That adds to these quick responses of, yeah, I'm not going to trust you with that one. Get out of here. And it's felt, and we're able to make these quick decisions from it. And that follows us. What it led me to, though, because you said it was for your own personal gain, right? And I started thinking about, we got to be careful, and we have to situate that because, sometimes we're in communities, but if you chose to join that community then has to inform you. See this we have to be careful and limit. It's not it's all or nothing, but there's limits to that. Say when I'm in a community, I choose to be in that community, and that means I also choose to understand what they're saying, accept it, or at least say, okay, now I have to reckon with it. And make a choice. Do I stay within the community? Do I go out of it? How do I make it work? And I think that was Whitehead's fourth piece, which is, how do I make it applicable to me? I'm in my world. And so I'm left with that when we're talking about truth, or the truthiness. I kind of wanted to jump back in and further defining how we understand metamodern truth, Theopoetics, and Dr. Keller's understanding of truth, and at least repeat from what I spoke in the beginning, and then where Metamodernism is now. Truth, I think when we're looking at it in hard sciences, really says, hey, there's truth out there. There's patterns. We need to realize those patterns. And that is what it is, because that is truth from its utilitarian, functional sense. I can do a lot of stuff with that. Physics, mind-blowing what we're understanding now. I just read that they found quantum, the quantum function in a human cell. I just read that yesterday. Meaning that this theory that we've been playing out in the world of computers and technology is within the human itself, in the cells, in the atom. And they've been able to see it. So that's a mind-blowing realization that this theory, which is baffling, is being realized and all that stuff. And there's those truths there. But is it the most absolute? Should we just run with that? Is the question. And in Metamodernism, it's saying, no, that's not the only truth. It is a talking partner, but we temper it with these other worlds that we live in. We don't only live in a world of physics. We don't only live in a world of quantum theory. We don't live in a world only of biology or chemistry, but we live in a world that has culture. We live in a world that is political. We live in a world that is philosophical. We live in a world that deals with, race. Those are the worlds we live in. Why? Because we categorized it that way. We've been talking about that. And so guess what? We talk about it. It's part of our world. And so there's truths within that, or frameworks of thinking, that we kind of have to put together. So at least for Metamodernism, they're saying there is no one way of understanding truth. There is no one truth. And there's no easy way to combine all the differences together. And we kind of have to do that work and see what emerges from it. And that falls along the lines of even what process thinking does. Process thinking agrees with that. Saying, what we're seeing is one dot within a background of dots, which is its background is complete and utter darkness because we haven't even peered through it. So it's never static. It's not even absolute because we don't even know what absolute is. It's not static. It's dynamic. It's a constant journeying. And that constant journeying forces us to admit, I don't fully have it. And that's why science becomes helpful, because science says we have a hypothesis. Does it work? Does it work? Does it work? Does it work? After the 10th time, I think we got something and we can work with that. I think we see that in religion. Religion started with one person talking about, here's an experience I had. Oh, I had a similar experience. Oh, I had a similar experience. Wow, this is powerful. And it moves along people and it formulates into a tradition or religious tradition that moves on and so forth. But it's not static. It's not this one. There's many on there. And I think Metamodernism understands that as well as process. But that means that we have to be skeptical if we're saying that one overarches another. Healthy skepticism on that. Catherine Keller on her book on the mystery talks about this conversation she had with a person on a plane, and the person was arguing for one, and she goes, there's another option. We could talk about relativism. The relativism is the understanding that there's many truths, and the goal is not to just like leap it away, just everyone do their own thing, but it's literally an understanding that there's differences, which forces us to congregate, to talk, to relate, and to come at a larger conclusion. When she started talking about that, the guy, she said in the story, the guy left, so she wasn't able to continue the discussion. But it's the way of saying truth, because it's multiple, should make us want to be relational, should make us want to propose, to inquire, the way science does. Why is the sky blue? There's a beauty to that. There's a beauty that we find in that. And I'll pause there. Go for it.
Oh man, that was beautiful. You made me think of our differences should push us to be more curious. Because based on what you were saying, it sounds like we should just be striving to learn. And therefore, if truth is what we're talking about here, that it's so fluid, it's so indescribable sometimes, even hard to just fathom that we don't know everything. Like you said early on in the dialogue, such a fraction of life we are, and it's just crazy, man. Like, why are we arguing? This is a question that has gotten louder, or in the language of Dr. Keller, it's a haunting. It haunts me. Why are we arguing?
Yeah.
If we're arguing over truth, we both got truth. We all got truth. Like, what are we really arguing about? And it's just crazy to me. I just don't have too many words for that. Like, it just takes me back to, the world right now is just so nuts. And it's just like, what are we fighting over, really? Like, everything is underneath our fingertips. We can share and all have, but it's just, we have a few that believe it's theirs, and they're fighting over, that's mine. Like a very small child that doesn't know how to share, that's mine. Don't touch my stuff. It's like, oh, no one taught you how to understand that, you can temporarily share that, and it comes back,
Yeah. Yeah.
So.
Yeah. You made me think about, I always talk about this and I'm fascinated by it, but I see its eeriness or concern, at least for me, that there's been a resurgence in debates on which Christianity is the right Christianity. So evangelical versus Catholic versus Greek Orthodox. Those are the three ones that I've been hearing the most. And it's fascinating to me, because what they do is, it is a clear discussion on nuances, the pure abstraction of things. And for me, Whitehead says, you go abstract, you're in trouble, because you can go farther and farther and farther. And the farther you go, the farther you are from the reality that you exist and live in. That abstraction, if we were to take that abstraction 20 degrees off and say, this is it, and then from that, we just live life, we're in trouble, because it's not tested. This is why, for me, that idea of the flight of an airplane, which is Whitehead's example, is this proposition has to fly. And by flying it is imagining its possibility, testing out in the real world, like actually flying, and seeing what are the problems that come from it. And it's that testing that's so valuable and important. And I don't think that's being done. I think we just say, this is how we should live. That's dangerous. That's dangerous. You mentioned earlier in the podcast or elsewhere, this purification is not good because it's not real, right? So if we erase history, well, that's not real. That's not real, and it's it's a telling of one history. It moves us away from what really happened and why there's these microaggressions and why there's these retaliations. And so it actually moves us away from where we should be going, which is harmonization, healing, and those things. So, I mean, yeah, those are just some of the realities that I'm seeing now. If I can just highlight just a couple of more things about how metamodernism understands truth. I think I mentioned, we got to be skeptical in thinking that our way is the right way, but it's not the other side, which is relativism. It's like Dr. Keller was saying, that relativism forces us to engage, not to be like, just let it be. Metamodernism does this thing between irony and sincerity. Sincerity is really meaning, okay, this is how I believe. This is what I believe. This is how I believe. But then it's ironic because it's like, we also understand that that's limited and that's subjective, right? So that sobering sense, that ironic sense that this is what I believe, but I also believe that it's not the ultimate belief. And I think that oscillating back and forth, I like that term. Metamodernism is taking that term. We oscillate back and forth. I don't think it's a pendulum. I think it's that, like the infinity sign, the number 8. I think that's there too. The truth for metamodernism is pragmatic too. It has to be useful, right? It's not only truthful, but it has to be useful, right? Whitehead in his process thinking, and Dr. Keller used it as well in Farber, has these these pieces on causations. And he goes, we can have a final causation, which is our internal selves of maybe the why. But he goes, whys don't matter. He goes, the efficient causation, which is the how and the pragmatic piece, is the most important because that is the medium by which your final causation is viewed. He actually calls it a superject, right? When the thing finally happens, is that that's how I think it. The thing that comes out. But that thing that comes out is the efficient. It's that yes that you gave. That's all a person has to work with. That yes. And we'll need to rebuild from there why the yes. So you hope that everything that's done prior kind of provides the formation of that yes, right? It's that final causation, but it's always efficient. It's always that pragmaticness and that usefulness and that it's for the now. I made that decision because of the now. I think metamodern understandings of truth really rely on dialogue to engage and that intersubjectivity. That means it's not only my own thinking, but I have to include others. That means I have to include race as a thinking piece. I have to think of economy. I have to think of culture. I have to think of just add all of those parts together and you get what is this dialogue and what does it look like? What does it mean to be fair and equitable and inclusive in that sense? And I think that then what metamodernism alludes to is that truth is actually constructed. Truth is a constructed piece. I think when we're looking at Catherine Keller or Roland Farber or John Cobb, you will see that. I think you will see those pieces very clearly in their work, but they'll do it in different ways. So for instance, Dr. Keller uses an apophatic framework to say God is not this, or truth is not this, or this is not this. And what that does, it forces us to say, I thought I had it, but I don't have it. So, I see those resonances there. And I also see resonance in the theopoetic space, primarily because Theopoetics says in that emergence of that understanding of God, it's also a break of an old image. Like, I always like that when you tell about the Pastelón, because you're saying food has a religious or deep spiritual connection, because it's symbolic of sustenance. It's symbolic of the natural and the supernatural. It's symbolic of so many pieces, and it reveals something about the divine. It reveals something about the soul of the earth, or the soul of the world, about what it's trying to do. But it challenges prior notions. How could God be found in food? When we say God is wholly other, the divine is wholly other, completely separate from us. But in and through a dish and a meal, through a human being, through things that are from the earth, which at this moment is kind of rejected. We don't want to think about that. That we see in the most rejected, in the most marginalized, in the things that people really don't want to touch, right? That we see the divine in a real way.
Deep. Yes. Really quick, what you just said took me back to the Gospels. And I know we've been back and forth about the Gospels, but the Gospels, when they're talking about interpreting what Jesus said on the Mount, or did with the man that was blind, or the women that, were rejected and all this, when he was in relationship with these people in this sort of divine spiritual dialogue. I like the one when the blind man, I'm blind, help me, paraphrasing, of course. And, Yeshua replies, like, what's wrong? Just get up, live life. Like, what's stopping you? And, it's so symbolic because, like, society, was telling him, you're blind, you're useless, you're disabled, you're nothing. And so he believed it, and then, this guy comes out of nowhere. He goes, I don't think, nothing's wrong with you. I think you're beautiful just the way you are. And it's like, damn, I should embrace my ability not to physically see, but understand that I can see the world clearer than the person who can see it with their eyes, like playing with these symbols, it's so deep within those four, gospels, where, they're playing with these different aspects of trying to highlight to the people what Yeshua stood for, symbolized, or taught them. The teacher, what did the teacher teach, through his actions and motions and embodiment and words and silence, right? Notorious for always going to prayer in silence. So he wasn't always talking, and then when he did talk, pay attention of what he was saying. He never repeated himself. And that's interesting. Even if they're portraying what he said, the story never portrays him repeating himself, never portrays him arguing with people, such as the religious folks at the time, like the Pharisees, excuse me. He wasn't arguing with them. Like, he was just like, listen, this is what it is. How could you say such things? Blasphemy, like the scrolls say this, and like he made them so disgruntled, but he never fed that energy, or never is portrayed feeding into that energy, I should say. You know what I mean? Like, the stories always shed light on how he remained in his truth. That's what we wanted to highlight, encapsulate how symbolically Buddha walked in his truth. A lot of people would have been like, you're crazy. You were a prince. You gave up everything. And instead he exchanged it for life itself, and so you see this throughout, history and throughout humanity, and the stories that we are still telling each other, right? That's also an important piece you brought up too. Before religion was written, or doctrines were written, beliefs were written, it was oral. Everybody was still telling stories, and we all understand how that works, right? You tell Joe don't tell it like you did. So it changed, but you got the gist of it, the meats, the skeleton of it. You're like, oh yeah, the names may have changed, whether the person wore this or not may have changed, but overall the symbolism to help you understand you are not random. You are not what the kings say you are, you are so much more. We are all so much more. We are messed up situations, yes, but these stories should be remindings. These dialogues should be remindings, greatness, like we're part of something way greater And our choices, right? We have to start taking our choices back. And we can't stress that enough, especially in today's world. It's getting more digital. Our choices matter so much because, we don't got resources or anything like that. But what do we have? We have the choice. Do we get up every day and do we make certain choices to try our hardest to make the world better? Even our own personal worlds better. We make choices to either spread truth that liberates people, or we choose to spread truth that controls people. From a political standpoint, you could say, these truths are being used every day on the most micro to macro. And it's just interesting. That's all we really can say, right? It's just interesting. And one more last thing before we end and close out, what you said about the infinity symbol, it hit me like a Mack truck, because we realize the infinity symbol is pretty much an intersecting circle. It's a circle that's been twisted. And so there's an intersecting point in the middle. And that made me think, interestingly enough, what if that intersecting point is what, rejuvenates us? And symbolically, we're all going through this, oscillation of an infinity symbol. But when we cross and meet, we get things. Maybe we pick up things. Maybe we learn things, and then on to another journey round back until we meet again, type of thing.
Beautiful. That's a beautiful thought there. Because I was thinking of the Ouroboros, which is the circle one, which has an intersecting point in the image itself, because it's swallowing, right? It's swallowing, but that's an intersecting point. It still is. And then the 8 sign, that middle piece has an intersecting point, which is a form of rejuvenation or it's interesting because it means it's either we're seeing ourselves, right, along the way in a parallel sense, or we're seeing everyone else in the other, repetition or something similar, but not quite, because I don't know if it's connected or if it's slightly off. We're only seeing one view of it. So there's a lot of now interesting components that we can think about as we're looking at that 8 sign and things of that nature. So yeah, and
we only get a moment to intersect, right? It doesn't last long, and there's not multiple opportunities. It seems like there's a ratio, there's a lot of journeying, and then there's a small amount of interconnectingness,
so gotta go.
right.
But but that intersection or that connectedness throws us on that journey again. So it's pretty cool. That's awesome.
That's dope. Well, that's it for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. Our next dialogue we have planned is a very special one. They all have been amazing, but next we look forward to having Dr. Keller, onto the podcast, join the dialogue, and help us go further into what truth is, as well as her works into truthiness, relational theology, and how even metamodernism is something that her work is touching on. Did you have any closing thoughts? Yeah, please.
No, it's exciting that we're going to have Dr. Keller with us. Her work on political theology, on climate crisis, on feminist thinking within a process relational framework is, profound and deep. I'm deeply grateful for her work. So it'll just be an honor to have her and to be discussing, like you mentioned, on truthfulness, on how we understand truth, but its implications on a worldly scale, on an ecological scale, and what that means and how it affects our theological thinking.
Definitely. On that note, we'll see you next time.